Okay, so this video is meant to be an introduction of what we're going to be talking about in class on Monday. And we're going to start with reviewing what we did on Friday. In Friday's class, we solved a system of equations by graphing. So I'm going to graph y equals negative 2x plus 5 first. Start at a y-intercept of 5, and then a slope is negative 2. So from that point down to 1 to the right, and then that's a lot of points. I don't need to really go backwards in that one, so then I'm going to draw my line. For the second equation, we need to put it into slope-intercept form. That's what we talked about doing on Friday, and we practiced that a little bit. So the first step in putting into slope-intercept form was to move the x term from the left to the right. And we can do that by adding or subtracting. We're trying to get it to cancel out to a 0. So since I see a negative 4, I need to change that to a, what I'm going to do to get rid of that is I'm going to add a positive 4. If I do that on the left-hand side, I have to do that on the right-hand side. So negative 4 plus 4 gives me 0 for that term. The other term I have is a 3y, and then 3y equals 3 plus 4x. The second step that we talked about then is to get rid of the coefficient. Since it's a coefficient, meaning it's attached to the y, we can't just add or subtract it. That'll make the whole term go away. We just want the 3 to go away, so we're going to do that by dividing. If I divide each of those, then I wind up with 1y, 3 divided by 3 is 1, equals 3 divided by 3, which is 1, plus 4 divided by 3, which is a decimal. So we're going to leave that, since that's our slope, that's the coefficient of x, that's our slope. We're going to leave that as 4/3 x. So then we're going to graph y equals 1 plus 4/3 x. So I start at 1, and I go up 4 boxes and over 3 to the right, up 4 boxes and over 3 to the right. Can maybe do that backwards, so go down 4 and left 3. And then I want to keep that going. So there's my red line. So Friday, what we talked about in class is that the intersection of those 2 points is the solution. My problem here is that the intersection in my purple dot is not at an exact grid point. It's not at that blue dot 1, 3. It's a little bit to the right and a little bit underneath it. So my solution is actually, since it's not an integer, my solution, x comma y, in this problem is actually made up of decimals. And if it's made up of decimals, which happens, I mean, they're numbers, then we can't solve by graphing. We're going to have to do something else. So if solving by graphing does not work, then you have to do something different. So you can pause your screen or pause your video if you have not written down this equation. What you could do is you can write down the system, y equals negative 2x plus 5. You can write down y equals negative 4x plus 3y equals 3. You could show the steps on getting it into slope-intercept form to get that red box if you want. And then you could just draw a rough sketch of the graph off to the left and show that sometimes when you intersect the 2 lines, they intersect at points that are decimals or fractions. And so solving by graphing does not work there. So how do we solve a system if graphing does not work? Or just what's another way to solve if we don't want to graph? So if you haven't written down that system, that's the same system from before. I want to go ahead and show that we changed this equation to the equation 1y equals 1 plus 4/3 x. And so what we can do is we can solve this, we call it solving it algebraically or analytically without using the graph. And I'm going to show you how to do that, and then we're going to spend some time in class doing that as well. But if you can write this down, this technique, then you at least have some steps to follow along with in class on Monday, and it won't be the first time you're seeing it. So once both equations are in the y equals mx plus b form, and I said from, so I'll have to change that to form, or no, I had it right. Once both equations are in y equals mx plus b from our graphing, we can set them equal to each other. So this is what that looks like. Since both of these equations are equal to y equals this expression, negative 2x plus 5, and y equals this expression, 1 plus 4/3 x. Since they're both equal to y, and what we are ultimately trying to do is find out, well, which y is that? And which x is that? We don't know. Since they're both equal to y, they're equal to the same thing, we can set them equal to each other. So I take one expression, negative 2x plus 5, and I set that equal to the other expression, 1 plus 4/3 x. And now I need to solve that equation. So we're going to learn how to solve equations when there's variables on both sides. If you haven't done so already, please pause your video and write down that step. The first step is going to be to add or subtract one of the x terms on both sides. So we have an x term of negative 2x, and we have an x term of plus 4/3 x. And it does not matter which one you do, but for consistency's sake, I will probably take the one that's on the right-hand side and work with that one. And so it says add or subtract because you have to base it on what you see. So inside the pink box on the right, I have a plus 4/3 x. I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to subtract 4/3 x. If I do that on one side of the equation, we have to do that on the other side of the equation. So on the left-hand side of the equation, I need to take negative 2 and I need to subtract 4/3. And this is where you either need to have a calculator or you need to download the Desmos Scientific Calculator app onto your phone so that you can actually work with fractions. So negative 2 minus 4/3 is negative 10/3. Or your calculator may say negative 3 1/3. I'm going to keep it at negative 10/3. So negative 10/3 x plus 5 is equal to 1, and the pink box in my blue term became a 0. Okay, it became 1 plus 0, which is 1, because positive 4/3 minus 4/3 is 0. So now I have an equation. Negative 10/3 x plus 5 is equal to 1. And feel free to pause the video as we go. The second step is to add or subtract the constant term to move it away from the x term. So a constant is a number that does not have a variable with it. So for example, this plus 5. Now 1 is also a constant. It doesn't have a variable with it. But the 1 is not by the x term. We're trying to move the numbers away from the x term. So if I have a plus 5, I'm going to subtract 5 on both sides. And now I have negative 10/3 x. The positive 5 with the minus 5 becomes a 0. And the 1 minus 5 becomes negative 4. And the solving is going to take some time. I move my screen a little bit. The final thing then to get x is to divide by the coefficient of the x term. So when I had a 2x, I'd multiply by, or divide by 2. I'm going to divide by negative 10/3. And so in your calculator, you might have to type in -4, hit your divide key, and if you have a fraction button, you might be able to type in the fraction. If you're using the Desmos app, you could do 4 divided by negative 10/3, but it starts to put it into like this giant fraction. If it doesn't give you the same thing mine gives you, then maybe you have to type in parentheses. If you're using the Desmos Scientific Calculator app, it'll actually show up like this: -4 divided by -10 divided by 3. And all of those, when you type them in your calculator, will give you the same thing, which is 6 divided by 5, or 6/5, or as a decimal, exactly 1.2. And both of those are okay. So x is 6/5, or x is 1.2. And that's not a rounded decimal, that's the exact decimal that we get for this problem. And so we did all of that to get the x term, and we need to plug it back in to find the y term. So the very last step is going to be to take this and plug it into one of your equations to find the y term. So I gotta go back up to the beginning, take one of my original equations, doesn't matter which one, and we're gonna plug in this x value to get the y value. So I'm gonna take the very top equation, -2x plus 5, y equals -2x plus 5. But instead of writing x, I'm going to write the decimal or the fraction. And again, the decimal is okay here. So -2 times 1.2 plus 5 is going to be 2.6. And so I have the y value and I have the x value. And so my final answer to this problem is 1.2, comma, 2.6. And if I go back to my graph, I can see that that yellow highlighted space is a little bit past 1 on the x and a little bit above 2.5 on the y. And so I have the final answer. And so I'm not going to do another example. You can go back and rewind the video and do what you need to do to get the steps to solve in your notes. And that's the first time you've watched this. So if you need to watch it again, I kept the video under 15 minutes so you can watch it a second time. And we're going to practice going through the steps and solving. I talked to like an Algebra 2 teacher and they said as long as students can solve equations, they can do almost anything when it comes to Algebra 2. So what we are really practicing in this lesson is going to be how to solve equations. So I would also like you to come up with some questions that you have. I know that watching a video for 14 minutes or pausing, maybe taking a little bit longer, isn't going to help you or isn't going to have you learn the entire concept. But go ahead and go back and look at the different steps and see if you have a specific question that by knowing the answer to that question, you're going to feel more comfortable with the topic. And then I'll give you a chance in class to ask me that on Monday. Thank you.